Well, good evening, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you and call to order our special council meeting for Tuesday, August 24th. Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest? Seeing none. So we are meeting as a public meeting where we're going to be receiving a report from BM Ross regarding a possible expansion of our wastewater treatment plant. Before I hand it over to Matt and Lisa from BM Ross, for anybody watching, I just want to make note that all of council is attending. Councillor Westman is on the call. He just has to attend with his video off, but he is participating in the meeting. So welcome, Matt and Lisa. It's great to have you with us, and Steve as well from BM Ross. And we've also got Renee Hornick joining us from Aqua, of course, who manages the plant. So at this point, I will hand it over to Matt.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Welcome, everybody, to this Public Information Center. As you heard on the possible expansion of the wastewater treatment plant. This is a public information center where we're going to tell you what's going on with the Class EA process. This is the first time of a report to council since the Class EA started. It has been going on a number of months now, probably since early spring. We have a technical team that meets every couple of months to discuss issues and advances and how progress. And we've met 4 times, and this is the first time where the rest of council that's not on that team is hearing about this, as well as the general public. I want to emphasize there's no decisions being made tonight. They'll come later in the process where council will have to make some calls. Right now, we're just passing on information. So we got the screen up, Lisa.
Go.
There we go. Perfect. Didn't want to lose. That's a pretty one. I can go to the next one. So our agenda tonight, we're just going to introduce the project. We're going to tell you what class environmental assessments are about, the consultation process for this one, and then it's going to get technical, the need for the expansion, review of the plant capabilities, looking at alternatives and where we're going with this. And then we will take questions. I'm sure that everybody that's on this meeting tonight knows that Lucan's been growing significantly for the past 10 years, and growth is expected to continue. We've been monitoring this for a number of years now, what we call the reserve capacity of the plant, because as you know, council allots capacity at the plant to development proposals. And then these proposals get built over time. It's an ongoing process. You kind of sometimes you don't lose track, but you want to keep up with what's going on. The plant's approaching capacity. We identified that as we looked at the reserve capacities, and we spoke about it a month ago when we presented the master servicing plan and presented a bunch of numbers. Currently, it's projected there's sufficient capacity until 2029. But it may be reduced earlier if development continues. It's been, the last 3 years have been quite a rapid pace. So that's why you start the environmental assessment early. You want to give it enough time to go through the process, design the plant, get it built, and you don't want to run out of capacity. And I guess that's a really important thing here for everybody to remember. As council allocates capacity, it doesn't all get built at once. So some of it's sort of hanging out there waiting for it to be developed. At some point, they reach the theoretical capacity of the plant, even though it's not running at capacity. And they can't allocate any more out because they don't have any. So the trick with this is to be ahead of that, so that when a development proposal comes to council in a couple of years, council knows where they're going with this. They've gone through the studies, they may be into the design, and they'll make a decision on when to build it. But then they can feel more comfortable allocating capacity because they will know it's coming. This is a really big deal for Lucan. This plant went in 25 years ago, and it's pretty much operated as it has. And since then, this is kind of a once in a generation occurrence. So you want to get it right, and you want to make sure you consider all the alternatives. So we initiated a class environmental assessment. I'm talking to council about it for a couple of years. We started it in early spring. We expect it will take about a year to do. So it'll be spring next year, and then you'd go into design, and then you go into construction. Design will take at least a year to get design and approvals. Construction will probably take the best part of 2 construction years. So we've got time. We're not rushed or anything, but we want to keep it moving. So from that point on, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa, who's going to talk to you about Class EAs and consultation, and then Steve Burns will come on and discuss a lot of the technical details with you.
Thanks, Matt. So the municipal class environmental assessment process, or EA, is the process that municipalities have to follow when they're looking at road, water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure projects. And this is so that they can meet the requirements of the Environmental Assessment Act. The kind of bonus of following this process is that it does allow for the evaluation of alternatives. And through that process, you can identify potential impacts. And then if there are impacts, what mitigation measures you might be able to put in place to minimize or mitigate those impacts. And when we look at the environment through the lens of the EA process, we're not just looking at the environment in terms of the river, the trees, the birds, that sort of thing. We also look at it in terms of the socioeconomic environment, the cultural and archaeological environments, as well as the technical environment, so that we can determine what the impacts on all those sort of features are and how they might interact. So the principles of the MCA process is that it's a systematic way of documenting a decision-making process. And the way the MCA works is that infrastructure projects, are grouped into similar categories based on their complexity and potential for impacts. And we call those schedules. And the schedules go from A plus, B, and C. And A is your kind of more regular routine type infrastructure projects, where it might be, replacing one piece in a existing sewage pumping station or something like that. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, C are your more complex, more technical projects that might have more impact. So that's where we get into new wells, new wastewater treatment plants, big expansions, that sort of thing. The foundation of the EA process for your Schedule B and Schedule C type projects is identifying your problem or opportunity. So that's the first step, is defining that. And then from that problem or opportunity, you look at what alternative solutions there are. And then you get into identifying and evaluating the impacts of each of those solutions. So this slide summarizes the steps in the Class EA process. And depending on what type of schedule that EA is, there are different numbers of steps that you have to complete. So a Schedule B EA or a Schedule B project must complete phases 1 and 2, which are identifying the problem and then evaluating alternative solutions. Whereas a Schedule C, you have to complete all of the phases. So that includes, after identifying the problem and the alternative solutions, is identifying alternative methods of implementing the preferred solution, as well as documenting it. So you get an environmental study report at the end. And then the last phase is, of course, implementation. So for the expansion of a wastewater treatment plant beyond its existing rated capacity, that is a Schedule C EA. So we will be doing all these steps. Consultation is a key component of the Class EA process. And as part of that, we are required to consult with provincial and federal agencies, First Nation and Métis communities, adjacent property owners, if there's any stakeholder groups that may be interested, and the general public as well. For most EAs, you'll have 2 mandatory points of contact, and these typically are the notice of study commencement and the notice of study completion. But for many projects, we will often hold a public meeting just to provide an opportunity for the public to provide more feedback and learn more about the project. So for this particular EA, we've already got it started on the consultation. So the notice of study commencement went out in the local papers, We also mailed it to local review agencies, the First Nation and Métis communities. And so far, we've received comments from the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, the Ministry of Heritage, Tourism, Sport and Culture Industries, as well as the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation. The notice was mailed out to adjacent property owners, so we made sure that they were aware that the project is being undertaken. And we anticipate that we'll have another public meeting at a later date when we have more information to provide to the public.
Your mic's off, Steve.
There we go. Thank you, Lisa. What I'm going to talk about now is really the more technical aspects of what we've done up to this point in time. I'm going to start off by explaining why we need to expand and including what we evaluated in terms of alternatives to expansion. I'll get into the details of how we might sort of physically expand and how that might be accomplished and what might be involved. But first of all, the need. The community of Lucan, is estimated to have about 3,300 people, and there's actually about 1,300 customers connected to the Lucan wastewater collection system and treatment system. Currently, the municipality has approved 360 units of development to be connected to the system in the future as those units are constructed and serviced and developed, and is considering another 345 units of development that have not yet been approved, but developers, individuals have brought forth proposals indicating they would like to develop. And those, that 345 is within the current urban boundary. There have been ideas and discussions about development beyond the urban boundary, but we are only looking at right now, or have defined what we know within the boundary. The Lucan wastewater treatment plant is rated at 1,700 cubic meters per day. That's the annual average daily flow that can be put through the plant. So it's essentially the flow over the whole year divided by 365. And we estimate that in 2021, by December, the average annual flow will have been about 1,300 cubic meters a day. So we are somewhere just a little over 80% of the rated capacity. And that rating is in an environmental compliance approval. It's essentially a license to treat that much wastewater. So we have a total reserve just under 400 cubic meters that still is available for those approved units, and some of it is available for those proposed units. If you take out the committed ones, the ones that are approved, there's still an uncommitted reserve of about 127 cubic meters a day, which will serve 127 equivalent residential units. And I'll explain what an equivalent residential unit is in a minute. So next slide. Yeah, here we go. So when developments are proposed, they're often a combination of sort of different types of development. We might get apartments, we might get multi-unit row housing type things, townhouses, or we might get single family detached units. And often the developments that we're seeing come forward have a combination of these, but sometimes they're just a single type. So the reason this is important is we recognize that the amount of wastewater depends on the type of unit that you have. In theory, an apartment will have fewer people than a single family detached, and there'll be some sort of corresponding lesser sewage flow from an apartment. And this is why we take into account these sort of different types, and we equate them all. We take the apartments and the multi-unit properties, and we equate them to single family detached and call them ERUs. So next slide. So we had the advantage here that the County of Middlesex, just this past spring, published an analysis of growth within the county. And they took each municipality in the county and projected what growth might be expected there. And their projections go out to 2046, about 25 years. And for Lucan Biddulph, they have projected potentially at a high growth scenario, 1,370 households, and at a low growth scenario, 810. And then they actually draw three lines, and the reference prediction is just a little more than the average of the high and low values. So they are projecting, when you consider that we have 1,300 customers on the sewage system at this point in time, they're projecting quite substantial growth over the next 25 years. And just the point at the bottom there is that we've been monitoring for some years the actual rate of growth, and it has been proceeding at or slightly exceeding the high growth line. So next slide. So this is just a picture to show graphically the county's projections, and it shows the low, reference, and high. And in this case, we have applied different unit types, apartments, multifamily, and single detached to those different household groups. And we did this by looking at the current proposals and what's approved and what's developing, and establish what sort of mix are we getting today. And we made the assumption that that mix would continue into the future, and predicted then the different quantities for each different housing type. So next slide. So when you take the households and you take into account the mix of development type, and you turn it all into ERUs, what you get is, again, a high growth projection of a little over 1,100, low growth about 659, and the reference prediction in the middle about 936. And again, I didn't get into the details of it, but in the case of Lucan, one ERU produces about 1 cubic meter per day of wastewater on an annual average basis. And that 1 cubic meter also takes into account non-residential development. So the assumption is if you grow residentially, you get continued growth commercially, institutionally, and so on. And that's all factored into that 1 cubic meter. Now, this slide again shows, in terms of a graph, if we have those three growth scenarios, how do they relate to the plant capacity of 1,700 cubic meters a day? And you'll see that if growth were to continue at the high growth rate, the flows to the plant would reach its capacity at about 2029. So it's not imminent, but and Matt talked about this as a council and as a municipality, you have to take into account what you're committing and what's coming forward as proposals too. So this graph is really showing the projected sewage flow, but it doesn't show the fact that some of these, in addition to the sewage flow, you've always got commitments out there. So then there's a couple of other on the left there in the text. It talks about there's some other sort of specific issues that relate to this. The headworks, which are the first component of the plant, are the current constraint to the plant in terms of peak flows, needs to be addressed. And the biosolids or the sludge management facilities are significantly undersized. And I'll get into the details of this later, but there are, even outside the issue of growth, there are a couple of problems that would really need to be addressed anyway, even if there was no growth. So next slide. So in terms of environmental assessment, what we like to do is make a clear statement of what the problem is that we are attempting to resolve. And so this is at this point in time, it's still subject to fine tuning, but it really says over the past few years, new growth and development in the community of Lucan has been accelerating at a significantly faster pace than the historic norm. The Lucan Wastewater Treatment Facility is approaching its rated capacity, and additional capacity is needed to accommodate future growth. So that's why we are doing this exercise, why we were doing this environmental assessment, is to find the best way to solve this problem. And in environmental assessment, in the Class EA procedure, you always start off by looking at sort of the high-level solutions to the problem, which range from not trying to solve the problem at all to the intricacies of how you might address it sort of technically. And in the case of this particular problem, which is generally a wastewater treatment plant capacity problem, we've looked at 6 different things that could be done. And this is a pretty typical mix for this type of situation. The first one is possibly we could reduce the existing sewage flows. And through reducing the existing flows, we would by default create capacity for future growth. So that's an option, and that needs to be explored. The second one is that the municipality could say, well, we want to limit the growth of the community. We have capacity for 1,700 cubic meters. We'll grow to that and just park it and stay at that. So that is in theory an option. We could expand the plant, which is sort of the theme of what we're doing here. Alternatively, we could replace it, and there have been projects where we started out looking at expansion and actually opted to replace. We could also, what is sometimes done, and often one of the first things that we would look at, is rather than expand or replace, we could re-rate, find a way to argue that 1,700 cubic meters isn't really the capacity, and we could actually treat more wastewater. And so that's an alternative which we have explored. And then in environmental assessment, we always look at doing nothing. You could just simply choose in many ways to ignore the problem and walk away from it. And that is left in there. It's usually there for if it evolves that there is a technical issue, or just simply solving the problem is just simply too expensive, then you could opt to do nothing. And it's rare, but it has happened. So next slide. So I'll go through these one at a time and explain what conclusions we have reached regarding the alternatives. But first of all, the issue here is the average flow to the plant. It's not peak flows from storms or anything like that. It's not bypassing of wastewater. It's the annual average flow relative to the rating of the plant, which is an annual average flow. In order to look at reducing the annual average, we need to understand that what's getting to the plant as wastewater is really made up of two components. It's made up of actual sewage coming from various properties, which we call the true sewage flow, TSF. And it's also made up of extraneous flow, which is, it's got II there. First I is for infiltration, that gets in through cracks. It's typically groundwater that's finding a way into the system, but it might be groundwater that's finding its way into footing drains that in turn some pumps pump the system. And then there's inflow, which is a direct connection, which is in modern sewage systems, newer sewage systems, we don't see very much, but it's a path by which rainfall gets directly in the system. And there's always a little bit in those 1 inch square holes in the manhole lids, or it might be a catch basin wrongfully connected, or different things like that. But so there's infiltration and inflow grouped together as extraneous flow. So we look at each of these independently and look at their ability to be reduced. And we assume that the true sewage flow is probably in the order of about 95% of the water that you supply to your customers. And in the case of Lucan, it's about 540 liters per day per ERU, about 200 liters per day per person. And comparing those numbers to other communities, similar communities, larger, smaller, the reality is it's actually a very low number. And so given that it's low, we don't feel that it's realistic to assume that you could drive it down much further. So then we look at infiltration and inflow, the extraneous part. And we looked at last year, 2020, and about 23% of the sewage, the wastewater that you treated at the plant, was extraneous flow. Now that sounds significant, and it is. It's not to be neglected or discarded, but it relative to most systems, other communities, it's also a very low number. And when you consider that extraneous flow is really collected throughout the whole system, it can be very challenging to find out where it gets in. And it can be also very expensive to actually take it out, because you might have to find an alternative place for it to go. You might have to replace sewers or undertake expensive rehabilitation programs to drive that down. So given that both of those numbers are low, it's our opinion that it's not feasible here to assume that we can reduce the existing flow to the point where you could actually create enough capacity. And just before I leave this, I think it's still very important to always pay attention to the the leakage in the system, the extraneous flow, and deal with it as you can, really as kind of an ongoing program, because it won't get better. It'll get worse over time. And if you're not addressing it, then through your normal project maintenance and budgeting and so on, this in 20 years from now will be a much bigger number than 23% and more important. So next slide. So then we get into looking at growth, and we know already that the existing flows and the commitments are about 93% of the plant's capacity. So there's still about 7% available to be allocated. Not very much. We know that if you were to say we're going to not grow beyond that 100, whatever would produce 100%, you're not being consistent with the provincial policy statement, which is the province's ideas of growth management. You're not being consistent with the county official plan or your own official plan, which all encourage growth. So you'd be swimming upstream against planning. We also know, in addition to the ideas about the fact that there should be growth, we know that there is substantial growth pressure. We know from the number of proposals, we know from things that we can see happening in the street that there is a desire for growth, and we don't expect it's going to decline. So limiting growth, we have rejected as a solution here. And we can expand the plant. It's not always a viable option, but in this case, it's a viable alternative that we need to look at. We know that the site is physically large enough. We know that the existing physical facilities, the plant itself, the structures there are capable of expansion. They were designed to be expanded. And I use the word there, more treatment trains are feasible. And I'll talk about a little later what I mean by a train, but it is physically feasible to expand what is there. We also, early in the exercise, talked to the Ministry of the Environment, MECP, Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks, and got their agreement to have an increased discharge to the Heenan Drain. The Heenan Drain is the first receiver for anything that we treat at the plant, and then it in short order discharges to the Little Osable River. And we got the ministry's concurrence with some caveats that it's possible to have an increased discharge. And so the conclusion is that we want to continue to look at this as a viable alternative and sort of flesh it out and see just how it might be done. So sometimes in this type of a project, if you get into looking at expansion, you may find that it makes more sense to replace. Circumstances might be that the facility is very old, technology is outdated, physically it's deteriorated, or it may be driven by the need to have a much better, higher level of treatment. And so in which case you might look at expansion. The assumption here is that if you were to expand it, you'd probably do it at a different location. But that's not necessarily so. You might do it immediately adjacent to the existing facility. You do this if the technology is not functioning well. But in this case, it is. The plant is treating the wastewater to the extent that it's supposed to. So that's not a driver for changing the technology. We know that Heenan Drain is an adequate receiver. We've determined that. So that's not a driver for going somewhere else and building a new plant. The plant facilities are about 30 years old, which is not old at all in the life expectancy of a wastewater plant. I mean, there are components that every 10 years or so you have to replace them, but the majority of the structures are good for 70, 80 years. A lot of the equipment maintained, it's good for 50 years. So the plant is relatively young, and then that is not a driver for replacement. And we know intuitively that if you replace it, it's going to cost you far more than if you expand it. Just simply because in a replacement, you'd have to replace the existing 1,700 cubic meters. So an expanded facility would be a bigger project than a replacement facility would be a bigger project than an expanded facility. So it's going to cost you more money. So the alternative 4 in this case, we've rejected. There's just simply no reason to do this. So the re-rating thing is always a good thing to look at, and it's usually the first step in looking for more capacity. And in this instance, we've rejected this as well. And the key reason is that it's already been re-rated once. Physically, what is out there is essentially the facility that was built 30 years ago. It's been 10 years ago, it had some improvements and so on. And with those improvements and an analysis of the plant, they were able to convince the ministry that really that plant could treat 1,700 cubic meters a day. So it got re-rated. Now, we conducted a detailed evaluation of the plant components, and we've concluded that it's not feasible to re-rate this plant again. It's been done once, can't be done again. So we're looking at physical expansion as a solution rather than re-rating. So this is rejected. So next, and then again, we're at do nothing, and just simply it's a choice to not resolve the capacity problem. It would be a lot like alternative 2, limiting growth. That would be the outcome of the default. But because we haven't really delved into the economics of this yet, and we haven't got really entirely into the weeds of the technical aspects, it stays as an option that an alternative that is continued to be out there and considered. So next slide. So we went through 6 different alternative solutions, and we rejected 4 of them, and we're left with expansion and doing nothing, as will continue in the mix to be evaluated further. And where I'll go next in the presentation then is more into the details of how we might expand. So this is a drawing. Can you, Lisa, put the cursor on the headworks? Can you figure out how to do that? Headworks is that square box, there it is, at the beginning. Now that is the first component of the plant. Wastewater comes in there, it's screened, some of the grit, sand and gravel and so on gets taken out, it's cleaned up a little bit, and then it goes into the next set of components of the plant, which is, it shows 2 rectangles. Those are called bioreactors. And there's two of them, they're identical. And that is where the principal treatment takes place. There's through a biological process and a chemical process, we treat the wastewater, and then it moves on to the next two rectangles, which are settling tanks. They actually take the material, the heavy solids that come into the plant and the solids that are produced in the bioreactor, and they settle them out so that what's leaving the clarifiers, those settling tanks, is clear effluent. And those two components, the bioreactors and the clarifiers, are settling tanks, are what we call the treatment trains. And there, you see there's two of them. So each one set can treat half the plant capacity. So in our case, about 850 or so cubic meters a day. Now, after the clarifiers, we leave, it goes out a settled material, relatively clear. It goes into filters. There's filters there, and it's polished to remove even more solids and remove more contaminants that are within. And then from the filters, it goes to the disinfection system, which is an ultraviolet disinfection system, and then off to the Heen and drain. So in each of the filters and the UV system, there are two sets of components, but really more for redundancy, for maintenance purposes, and so on. They really become a kind of a one train factor after the clarifiers. And down in the lower right-hand corner are your biosolids. So within the plant, you produce something called sludge, and you pump it over from the clarifiers over to the sludge management facilities, which provide sludge treatment and storage. And they are a component of the plant that is significantly undersized. They're part of the 1990s construction. Nothing was done in 2010 for them. They were designed based on a different standard in terms of volume that you should have. And we're just simply not sized for the sludge that you would generate from a 1,700 cubic meter a day plant. So the consequence is that much more often than desirable, the sludge has to be removed from those tanks and taken off site. So next slide. So so we went through an exercise of looking at each of the unit processes and figuring out its real capacity. And you see some different things here. The line that is way over to the right, oxygenation, that's just some mechanical blowers that are a component of the plant that are really physically quite large, but not a principal process component. The bioreactors, which is the top bar, in our process evaluation, we felt that their capacity is really about 1,650 cubic meters a day. So they are kind of the key constraint here in terms of increasing the capacity as the bioreactors. We're going to need more. Now, the other components are generally close to the 1,700 or a little more, providing we manage peak flows. And at this plant, all of the wastewater, essentially all of the wastewater that gets to it, comes from the Chestnut pumping station. And at that pumping station, when the flows get very high because of a rainfall event or something, peak flows are diverted to the existing sewage lagoons and then brought into the plant later. And you can see the value here of that diversion, because with diversion, we can see for the clarifiers and the filters and the disinfection system that we're good at 1,700 cubic meters. If we took out that diversion, if we didn't have those lagoons, all of those things would have to be, would have a lesser rating and need greater expansion. So we've looked at, and it's out of this exercise that we've really confirmed that you can't re-rate the plant. It's essentially rated pretty close to right. So when we then, now that we know what each component can do, we look at what are the considerations we have to make here in terms of how big it should be, how much capacity do we need. So we know we need to accommodate the growth projections, and we've projected growth out 25 years. We know in a normal project, if you had what I would call a greenfield project, you're just building your first plant, you'd build for 25 years. When you're looking at expansion, you don't necessarily have to look out that far, but we need to accommodate some reasonable amount of growth. We also always have to pay attention that there's uncertainty regarding that growth. And you think back to what the county predicted. They had 3 lines, not 1. And that is a measure of uncertainty. And the high growth line is almost twice as much. It's about 1.8 times, I think, the low growth projection. So there's a lot of uncertainty. It might grow or it might not. We always have to pay attention to the receiving stream, in this case, the Heenan Drain and the Little Ausable, because they have a finite ability to accept effluent. And so that sort of plays into the analysis here. And we look at current performance and expandability. And I've already mentioned that the plant is sort of physically constructed to be expanded or could be expanded. And we look at how well it's performing. Do we have to change the process so it treats better, or do we have some flexibility there? That comes into play here. And certainly we look at capital and operating costs for an expanded facility. Money is important. It's important to everybody. And it's not just what it costs to build, it's what it costs to operate. And so that's a key factor in figuring out how and to what degree we would expand. And then the last consideration we've made, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail, is that because we are expanding, we have we create the opportunity to decommission the Granton wastewater plant and have that wastewater in Granton pumped to Lucan for treatment. And it's viewed as an opportunity. And in environmental assessment, we don't just look at problems to solve, we look at opportunities to grasp and take advantage of too. So that's the thinking behind looking at Granton, and I'll talk about that in some detail. So this is, we're now getting into closer to what you can view as proposals. In terms of growth, although the county had 3 projections, we are really working towards expecting that it will be the high growth scenario that happens. And that's based on the fact that we're already marching along at that high line or higher. And we know that there's considerable pressure for growth. So we feel that in terms of planning expansion, it's important to just consider that high growth line. We know the flow that we're planning for based on the expected units that will materialize at high growth and so on, that we predicted that the 2046 flow will be about 2,400 cubic meters a day versus the 1,300 that we see there that we expect will get to the plant this year. We've had discussions back and forth with the Ministry of the Environment regarding how well we have to treat the wastewater, and that this is all works backwards from the capacity of the receiving stream. And we know that the present treatment process is satisfactory, and the ministry agrees. The ministry is concerned about us putting nutrients into the receiving stream. And by nutrients, there's really two of interest. One is phosphorus, and the other is nitrogen. And they're your common things in fertilizer, and they're the common components of sewage, even treated sewage. And when you add nutrients to a receiving stream or a lake or whatever, you encourage plant growth and so on. So that's, the ministry's a bit concerned about that. And the province has a rating system for receiving streams, policy 1, policy 2, and so on. And a policy 2 stream is a stream that already does not meet provincial water quality objectives. And the consequence of it being a policy 2 stream is that they don't want you to make it worse. Just because the fact that it doesn't meet objectives is not a rationale to make it worse. In fact, it's a rationale to make sure you don't make it worse. And so, with respect to phosphorus in particular, the Little Osable is a policy 2 stream. And so phosphorus is going to be the constraint for capacity here. And it's going to limit the amount of expansion based on the existing method of treatment to about 2,700 cubic meters a day, which is about 12% more than the capacity we need at the high growth line. So that 2,700 is actually, in our thinking, a good number. You know, we could have done the math and the analysis and it come out at a lower number, but it didn't. We've got more than the capacity we need for the next 25 years based on the high growth expectation. So next slide. So in terms of physical expansion, we're going to see a number of things that have to be either made larger or more of. And at the Chestnut Sewage Pumping Station, we will need larger pumps to get more wastewater to the plant. We expect we will have to parallel the sewage force main the sewage is transmitted from there. It's the pipe that from Chestnut to the plant would be paralleled, and that will also provide some redundancy, security. Bioreactors and final clarifiers there'll have to be more of them. Filtration, have to be likely another filter for sure. UV disinfection, it will likely result in replacing what is there now with a larger UV facility. rather than attempting to add more. But that is a final design detail that will be worked out. And one of the most extensive components of the expansion will be to correct the deficit in the biosolids or sludge treatment and storage. And as part of that, one of the things that we're actually looking at is taking treated sludge, expanding the treatment component of it, and pumping the treated sludge over to the lagoons for storage. So using the lagoons, not just for peak flow equalization, but also to treat and to store our sludge. It's the alternative is large concrete tanks at the plant, and we already have lots of those. So if we can take advantage of lagoons, it would be much more economical. So again, it's the same slide as before. So we're looking at expanding the bioreactors and the clarifiers. And I talked there about there's 2 trains. So we can expand as we have the option here of adding 1 more train, which is in effect a 50% expansion, or adding 2 more trains, which is in effect 100% expansion. Now, 50% will get us to I don't know, somewhere between 2,200 and 2,475 cubic meters a day, depending on some options we have for the bioreactors. So that 50% expansion gets us to, or maybe slightly under to slightly over the 25-year growth projection. But so if we did 4 trains, which is certainly an option, we would, that would be what we would do to get to 2,700 is actually have 4 trains, but then we would have a surplus of capacity because the ministry won't allow us to rate the plant above 2,700. So again, the logical approach to expansion is to add more trains, and we're looking at it currently in our analysis at should it be 1 or should it be 2, and what's the benefits and the costs of both, and it's going to be largely, I think, an economic decision, but there could be other factors that play. It is not in terms of wastewater treatment. You can have too much capacity by having 2 tanks too big. It can make it more challenging to treat well. So that's something that gets weighed in there in the final design as well. So, but we know that with 1 train, we've got capacity till at least 2040. We could service 900 equivalent residential units beyond the current usage, and that 900 units would take all of your present commitments. It would take all of the present proposals and provide capacity for another 325 future proposals that really haven't come to the table yet. So that's what 1 train will do. So that the next thing we looked at is Granton, and again, this is viewed as an opportunity. Generally, it's always better to have 1 plant than 2. Looking after 2 things takes more effort than it does 1, and so that's why this sort of rises up as something to be worth looking at. If we were to decommission the Granton plant, the we would have to treat immediately 120 cubic meters a day of wastewater that we're right now treating at Granton. So that would have to be treated in Lucan. So that's a consequence. But another consequence is that there would be an overall reduction in the system operating costs. You wouldn't have a hydro bill or a gas bill or chemical costs or maintenance or future liability. All these things that you have for Granton today would be gone. They would, to some of them, would migrate in some form to Lucan, but overall there would be a significant reduction in operating costs. But the downside is it will cause, we estimate that it'd be somewhere in the order of about $3 million to build a pipe from Granton to Lucan. And so taking the money you save on operating and future maintenance and setting money aside for replacement and so on, it would still take about 22 years to pay back. So our thinking is that at a 22-year payback, that's not a number that makes this immediately attractive. And it's kind of a number, well, you maybe want to wait and see what's going on. And then the other thing in terms of wait and see is we don't really know how fast Lucan will grow and whether Lucan will need that 120 cubic meters a day. And so there's value in waiting to see whether that 120 cubic meters is important or 10 years from now is readily available and could be used, in which case you might go back and revisit. So both the staging thing, exercise, and this decommissioning of Granton, no decisions have been made. We're analyzing that now, looking at them, but they will be decisions that council will have to make before the end of the environmental assessment. So at some point we'll come back to council and we'll be looking for an answer. Do we or don't we on these things? And we'll have more facts and figures to help make that decision in the future. So that's about where we are technically. We are right now finalizing the effluent quality criteria, performance criteria for the plant with the ministry. We're about 90% there, I think, and it's needed to get it down in writing now. We're looking, much of the effort now is focusing on the probable costs of a 1 train expansion versus a 2 train expansion. And we're actually writing our final report, preparing the text as we go, making sure the consultation is documented and the alternatives we've looked at, all of that's documented, and that's kind of an ongoing work in progress. So that's what we're kind of at technically right now. And then for next steps, so we'll continue the technical evaluations. We'll prepare a draft environmental study report for stakeholder and council review. And there'll be another one of these public information centers when we have published that draft report and people will be able to comment on it. But so we'll be back for more public input at a later date. So I'll turn it back to you, Matt, or however you wish to handle it, but for questions.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. Madam Mayor, how do you wish to handle questions from our audience?
Yeah, I think that council can ask their questions now. And we don't have at this point any members of the public that have joined into the meeting. So council might as well take this opportunity to ask their questions. Okay, so does council have any questions? Deputy Mayor Manders.
I just want some clarity for the public or the press, I guess, just on the comments on Grant, and that makes we are looking at a proposal there now on a 28 unit condo, that the comments you got that's being made today is from an efficiency standpoint, which makes total sense to me, not a capacity concern by anybody, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, yeah, well, thank you.
There is, just to expand a bit, the Granton wastewater plant is not operating at its capacity. It could accept more wastewater. There are limitations, but it has capacity.
The other comment that intrigues me on potentially maybe not at this stage, from just thinking out loud, on a second train and decommissioning the Granton plant and making it more efficient running out of Lucan, would be keeping our eyes open in the next 10, 12 years on you would think that would be look very favorable on a federal, provincial, any kind of grants on decommissioning a plant, becoming more efficient, and reflect very well in a grant proposal. I look at this as, potentially, one train. Why would we do two train? Two train would have to be done if we ever did the grant idea, but I think our staff should really consider that and keep their eyes open the next 4 to 5 years for any kind of funding. Just a comment. Thanks.
Okay. I see Councillor Westman's hand is up. Do you have a comment, Alex?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Well, just my thoughts on the decommissioning of the Granton plant. I get it for efficiency and all that, but a couple of things come to mind is that if we were to go to the residents of Granton and say, you've just paid down your sewer debenture here just a few years ago, and now you got a new one, I think they would revolt. Because we've already made the case talking about the condo proposal that we're only at 45% capacity. So I think it'd be a real hard sell to the people of Granton, because I have to quite frankly say it's a bit of a hard sell for myself as a resident there and as the councillor. So I know I get the idea of efficiency, and was probably what should have been done in the beginning. Rather than building a standalone plant, we should have maybe piped it over to Lucan and made that investment then. But I do believe that if we propose a 22-year new debenture for the residents of Granton, there's going to be some real strong pushback. I'm just saying. My two.
Thank you for that, Councillor Westman. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Regan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have a few, if that's all right.
Certainly.
Thank you. So I just have to ask a couple of questions. Alternative 2, talking about limiting community growth. This is just a question. It may be for Ron, maybe, but and then I know we have the provincial policy statement. We've got our own, the county OP. We've got the township OP. But if a township actually couldn't afford to do this, so just hypothetically, could they get some sort of exemption from that growth mandate from the province or the county? Could that happen? Like if they just said, if we just, or not we, but if there's any hypothetically, could we just not grow? Not that I'm suggesting we should. I'm just asking if that's an option. I don't know who wants to answer that. Ron? Yeah, maybe, sure.
I can take a stab at it, Madam Mayor, if I may. I'm not aware of any situation where this has occurred, where no growth, they've artificially put the clamps on. It's happened because they weren't ready with the plant. I've seen scenarios where there's been a building freeze. Actually, Lucan was in a building freeze when I started in 1990, 91. So it has sort of slowed things down, but there was always a plan to expand. It was just a matter of getting the grant money at that point in time. And we were lucky enough to get an 80% funding program through the federal and provincial ministries at that time. So we were fortunate. Those grant programs aren't out there anymore. And certainly growth is supposed to pay for growth. However, and it's all good on paper, but when it comes right down to it, we have a plant that is, now 30 years old actually. And it's like your car, it doesn't last forever. It eventually parts have to be replaced, and sometimes it's tires, but sometimes it's a lot more than tires. Sometimes, it's a motor or something that's major. So I think we're approaching the point where we need some major investments, and it just so happens that we can maybe combine the expansion of the capacity with the renewal and maybe make it a little more efficient. And I think that's what the folks at BM Ross are trying to do. So
I have a comment and then two more questions, if I may, Madam Mayor. So first, I was out at the plant today for an hour and a half tour, and I just wanted to thank Renee. It's very nice to have somebody that passionate about sewage taking care of us. So thanks, Renee. No, man, I'm not trying to be funny. It was an amazing tour, and just somebody that's passionate about their work that's what you need. So a question maybe for Matt or for, and I'm not sure who else might be able to answer it, maybe Lisa. But when you're talking about extraneous flow and like those little leaks that sort of add to the capacity or so take away from the capacity, and I know it's a low percentage, but is that something the township should really be looking at, is trying to find all of those small leaks? I mean, every little bit's going to help and it's going to give us more capacity, or is that just something that's just maybe just too expensive to do? Because I know I've heard that there have been leaks in the system before, and it's actually caused some issues with capacity. So I'm just wondering if that's something that is it something we should be looking at, so investing money in, maybe fixing it now in case it gets bigger later? Again, I'm not an engineer, so I don't know. So
We'll let Steve take that one on. He's been involved in a few of these.
Yeah, I believe quite strongly that you need an ongoing program to address those leaks, to find them and repair them as you can. And I think our conclusion was that it's not an alternative to an expansion, but that's not a conclusion that you shouldn't make your best effort to reduce the existing flows. Because I think I made the comment that whatever it is today, it's going to get worse in the future if you don't address it.
Again, Madam Mayor, thanks. So just really quick, two more really quick. So one thing that I saw that I didn't see in this is why we're not exploring or even considering alternative technologies that may be available in addition to an expansion. So if you say expansion, so why are we? I'm just wondering why that was sort of missing, because we know that they exist now. And I guess we're not sure in 5-10 years, and I'm sure there's some grade 9 student somewhere, probably goes to Medway, that'll end up graduating out of Waterloo, that'll come up with some brilliant sort of suggestion on how to deal with that. So I'm just wondering why other alternatives weren't mentioned in these, other alternatives that wasn't mentioned in the alternative. Sorry. So
I can try that. The alternatives that we look at in terms of the treatment process are driven by how well you have to treat the wastewater. So there's lots of different technologies, but what is there now is a relatively simple, straightforward process that we are confident is economical to expand. If we had to have better treatment than than we do now, and the better treatment, or the ministry was looking for better treatment, then that is when we would begin to look at in more detail at different technologies. Now, having said that, the technologies that we will use in terms of equipment and so on will be 21st century. They won't be what you saw out there, much of which was from 1990. Okay? Right. So the equipment in all of that type of work it'll be the current technology.
Right. Okay. And I have one last one. So, and I know the engineers aren't going to like this, but I really have a problem with your math on the equivalent residential units, because I'm thinking as a resident and a ratepayer and somebody who teaches anthropology, that when you have a single detached home is one ERU with 4 people in it, all right? 4 people live there. And you have an apartment with 4 people in it, it's 0.6, and a row house is 0.75. I just find it hard to believe that 4 people in an apartment are gonna sort of poop less than 4 people living in a house. And I'm not trying to be funny. I'm just thinking, I'm not sure, to my mind, if you say it's one single family living in, or single family of 4 living in a detached home are going to be one ERU, and a family of 4 living in an apartment is 0.6. That doesn't make any sense to me. And to me, it just seems a little dangerous that it kind of underestimates the use, if you understand what I'm saying. And I don't know if that's an accurate, but to me, that's just, I mean, somebody may ask me that, and somebody's watching this, or a resident's going to say, well, why, how can that be different? So why is it, 4 people in a house, 4 people in an apartment? They're going to be using the facilities, at an equal amount, I would assume. And again, does it underestimate the usage?
Well, Steve will talk, but one of the things, Dan, these are averages of people in these type of units. So if you've got 4 people in an apartment and 4 in a house, you may have 1 person in a house. And these are averages of actual population densities. So on average, you get less people in an apartment. You could have 7 in a house and 7 in an apartment, or 1 and 1. So it's an average. I don't think they're underestimated. You actually use less in an apartment situation than a house, even with the same amount of people.
So sorry, I just wanted to ask about that. So is that like an industry measurement, or is it like a Lucan Biddulph measurement? Like, because you know what I mean? Like, is this measure, and I'm just asking, is this measurement from Toronto?
No, so when they do the censuses and they ask, especially the long census, where they figure out, where you're living, how many people are in the house, they come up with these densities for population. So when we've done development charges in the past, quite similar numbers were used. You don't charge the same development charge to an apartment as you do a house, because the expectation is less use. And so these are at least Ontario, and then probably could be countywide. Somebody's figured out the density. Lisa, are they Lambton?
They're Lucan Biddulph.
Lucan Biddulph, they are, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, everybody. I'm done for now.
I was going to say that, but it's a good thing you chimed in and said that. Councillor Hodgins.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone at BM Ross for the presentation. That was informative. I may have a couple questions. I'll try to be quick. My first question is, with the projected growth in the ERUs, I didn't really hear anything about industrial development or institutional development. I just wonder how that's captured or accounted for, knowing that we do have some industrial lands that we're trying to develop.
Steve, you want to do that?
Sure. The assumption that we work with is that, like right now, you have a proportion of your total land use is industrial, commercial, institutional. And the assumption is that as you grow residentially, that proportion will remain the same. And the way we take it into account is in the 1 cubic meter per ERU. That includes an allowance for that non-residential growth, which we assume sort of runs in parallel with the residential. And one of the reasons we do that is that it's easy to track residential units and the growth that comes from residential development proposals. It's much more difficult to track non-residential. But if you work from the assumption that it's more or less going to be parallel, we take it into account in the flow number, and it's therefore accounted for. Does that help?
Yep, thanks. Could I have another question? I guess I know you said that BM Ross is looking at establishing the cost of 1 train versus 2 trains and the options, and there's going to be some sort of cost analysis put into this decision making. But do we have sort of a high level of preliminary cost estimate for this? And maybe could we speak to how it is being funded, this expansion? I'm not sure if that's to staff or to BM Ross.
Well, I'm not sure there's, we always get asked this question, everybody, it's always about money, right? And no matter what you're doing, we will establish, a better cost estimate. I don't know if Steve's got a high level one or not. Funding hasn't been talked about yet, Councillor. It's a big deal. There will be an analysis of funding, especially as this goes along with development pays for development. The expectation in the years I've been working at Lucan is that development will pay for a majority of the costs of this plant. I mean, there are some upgrades going on too, to the headworks and things like that, where there's deficiencies, but the expectation is this will show up in your development charges, and it won't be insignificant because sewage and water projects add a lot to development charges. Your development charges, let's say, have been in the range of 6 for a bunch of years now. You get into a plant here, you just have to sort of do raw numbers in your head and throw a bunch of $1 million out and divide it by the population. You can see big numbers out there for development, but there's not much other choice. We're not looking to go back to septic systems, which can cost $30,000 a piece now. So it's going to be a big number. We would expect most of it to come from there. I would expect the municipality and staff to be looking as you get closer to design and construction of grants that are available, whether they're green grants or efficiency grants, or mostly the province and the feds got out of the job of funding future development. The grants you got back 30 years ago, and a lot of the small municipalities got, were for them to get into the sewage game and the water game. They don't exist much anymore. But there's always changes of government. You just never know what's going to happen. And I can been in this a long time, and I've seen governments come along and want to fund development. Look at all avenues.
If within our report, we will discuss how this project could be financed. Like it's part of the impact analysis. We'll provide numbers for the potential impact on development charges. And there will be components of this project that can't be charged to development charges. Some of the rehabilitation of the existing is not something you can say is a responsibility of growth. So we'll carve out all those pieces and show how it will impact on you on sort of capital in terms of borrowing and allocation of costs, but also in terms of your wastewater rates, what you charge for to have wastewater treatment. That'll all be presented in the final analysis here.
And may I ask one final question, Madam Mayor?
Yeah, I'm just going to get, if you don't mind, Councillor Hodgins, Ron, just to chime in on the funding as well.
So I was just going to mention that this past week we had the annual AMO conference, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, and all the lower tiers within Middlesex County sort of combined to hit a number of the ministries. And what we're trying to do is to get their attention that growth for them, we're trying to get them to fund the growth aspect of water and sewer expansions. And what that means is growth is good for everybody. It's not just good for the municipality, it's good for the province, it's good for the feds. It keeps everybody working. It puts money into the economy. It's kind of the circle of life, really. So we're trying to get some support there. It's probably going to take a few years, I imagine. May not ever happen, but we can certainly try, and that's what we're trying to do. So while I have the floor, Madam Mayor, if I can maybe go back and make a little more history. Councillor Westman had spoken about, maybe we should have pumped, rather than built the Granton plant, pump it to Lucan. The Granton sewage situation started prior to amalgamation. Amalgamation happened in 1999. And really that snowball was already rolling down the hill by the time amalgamation happened. I do recall a discussion at that point in time about, is it prudent to build a separate plant, or is it better to pump it all the way to Lucan? And I don't believe at that point in time, the discussion, I don't believe there was a pressure sewage line that went that distance. And there was quite a bit of concern amongst the engineers that it would go septic before it ever got to the Lucan plant, and it would totally upset the process, I guess. So at that, I think since then there are situations where it's been done, and it's been done well. So hindsight is always great, of course, but if we had to do it over again, maybe we would do it that way. But I do agree, Councillor Westman, we did have that discussion internally about, geez, we just finished paying that debenture over there in Granton. We're not going to be overly popular if suddenly we go back and go, yeah, we're going to change direction here. So trust me when I say we're very aware of that type of situation, and we'll keep that in mind. And it's never a perfect science, but we try and keep it as economical as we can and do the best for everybody. So, thank you.
All right, thanks, Ron. Okay, Councillor Hodgins, back to you.
My last question, I'm just wondering through this DA process, if we will be exploring the use of possible green technologies or energies when looking at upgrading the plant, especially noting that there may be opportunities for grants of that sort. Any comment on that?
Take it, Steve.
Sure. We will definitely look at every opportunity in that regard. We recognize that's what grants are being given out for now, and the value of that. But it's really more of a final design consideration than it is. And so there'll be lots of during the final or the design of the expansion, there'll be choices made and evaluated and presented to council about, do you do it or not do it?
Okay, are you good then with that, Councillor Hodgins? Okay. All right, any other comments or questions from council? Deputy Mayor Manders.
Just one more. I think during your presentation, I think someone alluded to potentially something new at the expansion, and that would maybe be to move treated sludge over to the lagoons. And I guess I just, from my standpoint, I have no idea what that means from a smell standpoint only, as we've just bought acreage there to do our soccer field. So that whoever made that comment, that sounds like that'd be something new that'll be looked at rather than tanks. And can you please comment on the soccer field proposal beside there, if we decide to do that, that's new, if I'm correct in what I'm saying?
Steve?
Sure. Well, it's, again, this, we haven't decided to do that. We are
So
looking at that,
Understood.
but, and I'd be interested to know where your soccer fields are relative to where we might want to store sludge. But I'm pretty confident there would not be odor issues. We've done this in many places, and I mean, it has to be done right and managed right, but you wouldn't notice that it's there any more so than you notice the lagoons at the present time.
You answered my question right off the bat when you said there wouldn't be odor concerns. Thank you. And the one last thing is just a comment again. I don't know if Jeff Little's on the phone or the gentleman, I guess, is we should always, one thing with our sewer plant and our decisions is we're very lucky to own the land around, and it always concerns me as we continue to sell our industrial property and our land around that plant that we make decisions today for land use 50 years out. That's more of a concern of mine, our taxpayers owning that land as opposed to even the size of the plant. Not a maybe discussion for today, but I sure hope we make right decisions today for 50 years out in land beside the plant. Thank you.
Okay. All right, any other additional comments? Just back onto the lagoon storage that Dave just brought up. I had written that down because to the point that this would be something new that we're looking at. I guess would that affect the EA process, or does it affect that, or is that a separate process on top of what we're going through now to increase the store or look at storage differently with the lagoons?
It's part of the same process.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not, it would all be wrapped up in the same project.
Okay. And then the talk about, or the concern about the phosphorus levels. And if I'm understanding correctly, it's the phosphorus coming in to the plant, not the additives that we put in through the process. And I guess, I mean, it's part of living in an agricultural community. We've got phosphorus. It's all part of fertilizer. I know that there are some farmers in the area that are working with Upper Thames on different strategies to help try to move the phosphorus differently. But just wondering, I guess just to confirm, it's the phosphorus coming in, not what we're adding. And is there anything that our farmers can be doing, or should we be working with them to better deal with the phosphorus? Because whether we expand or not, that's an issue for the plant.
Okay, within the plant process, the treatment process, we are not adding phosphorus. In fact, there's a lot of effort goes into doing everything possible to take it out. It's in the raw sewage. It's a component of it, along with other things too. And so a lot of the focus of the plant is to reduce the phosphorus as much as possible. Anything that can be done to improve the quality of the Heenan Drain or the Little Osable River is to everyone's benefit. It isn't going to, there's no way that, in fact, I've worked on projects where we argued that if we improve the inputs, reduce the inputs from agricultural usage, we should be allowed to put more in from our sewage plant. And we're not making that argument here at all. We're in fact, we're working on the principle that we won't put in any more. we'll live with what we're allowed now. And, but anything that is done to improve the overall quality of the stream is to everyone's benefit. But it won't affect our project.
Okay. Okay. And then back to the leaks that Councillor Regan brought up. And Steve, you talked about, an ongoing program. So again, I guess even if we don't expand, we should look at an ongoing program. Do we have one? Is this something that, obviously we're constantly looking at the system, but is there anything we need to be doing above and beyond what we're doing now? And what does that look like, I guess?
I guess if I could jump in there,
Sure.
Madam Mayor. So, and I don't know roughly the year. I'm thinking back about 3 years ago. The Lucan sanitary system was cambered, and we have video camera from the whole system. So, at that point, we were able to determine the quality of the sanitary lines in the ground. It did show some areas where we need improvement, and that went into the asset management plan in spots where we have to fix some of the sanitary lines. Generally, we didn't see a lot of infiltration due to deterioration in the pipe. What we do see is there is some high flows during heavy rains, which you can come, you can look at two different points of entry there. One in the street itself in our area, which could be we could be putting out, lack of a better word, barriers to stop water from entering into into our road allowance. But we're also getting infiltration through sub pumps and people's basements that illegally hook in. That type of program, and I've participated in it before. If we can start narrowing it down to a certain section of town, and we want to start knocking on people's doors, it raises some issues also. So, but at this point, we haven't seen the real, we haven't seen the real problem there. We know we have some, just like all municipalities do. So that's one area that I guess we could start a program, is looking at that. I know years ago, I think Ron could probably comment that Lucan did a program a few years ago where they did ask and participate with homeowners to disconnect any sort of lines that were directly into the sanitary lines. John participated, and in fact, I think there was financial support for people to do that also. So there has been attempts at it, but at the same time, I think, and I'll maybe put it back to Steve, is that our infiltration levels are fairly low compared to a lot of municipalities. So I don't think there's a panic in some of this stuff. Doesn't mean we ignore it, and it doesn't mean that we don't keep working towards it, especially on the improvement of our sewer system, which we'll continue to keep doing. So that's just some comments right now.
Okay. Steve, did you have anything to offer on that, or?
No, I think Jeff's covered it. I think just from my perspective, it's a long-term effort.
Right.
It's something you do constantly. There's a number of ways to attract, to define what you have to do, establish what you have to do. But no, it's not going to have an impact on the plant proposal. That's
Okay, no, perfect, thank you. Ron, did you have some more background to add to that, as like Jeff said?
Yeah, I can maybe add a little more than that, Mayor. The subdivision encompassing Kleinfeld, Nicolline, Harold Court, that area, those homes were built in, I believe, the early to mid 70s. And at that point, the ministry was actually allowing, and the building code did not prohibit foundation drains or weeping tiles being directly connected into the sanitary. So again, with that being the scenario, people were happy there was no sump pumps in there. However, every time it rained, our flows to the plant would go off the chart. So when we got the 80% funding to build that plant, it came with the knowledge of that there was extra I&I flows that were generating huge capacity issues at that point. So it was built knowing the problem existed at the time. Fast forward, I think 2 years after we built the plant, along came the first infrastructure funding program from the federal and provincial governments. And actually, Lucan was able to come out on top of all the lower tiers in the county, much to the chagrin of much larger populations, because the calculations were based on the capital expenditures for the past number of years. And because we just did a large sewage treatment plant and tapped into the Lake Huron pipeline and put up the water tower and everything else, we had spent a ton of money in the qualifying period. So we ended up with I think it was $570,000, and the council of the day decided that, okay, you know what, we're gonna maximize the use of this money, and we're going to force those people who don't have sump pumps to basically disconnect their foundation tiles or the weeping tiles and install a sump pump. So Jeff did say we did offer financial incentives. We offered 100% to pay for it, up to $1,200, which was more than enough in most instances. So a lot of people, they were not happy, but I think they understood that it needed to be done, and how they understood that it needed to be done was, unfortunately, the 1 September prior to this program starting, we had I think it was a 12-day period, 12-day stretch where we had 7 inches of rain, and some people on Herald Court got flooded out. There were literally geysers coming out of their floor drains. I think it was 3 separate times. They just get it cleaned up and then it would happen again. And so there was some very upset neighbors, and that had an impact on everybody at that point. So everybody understood that it needed to get done. So, I think, again, the council today did the right thing. So by disconnecting all those weeping tiles and installing sump pumps, we artificially created more capacity, which was one of the alternatives that the BM Ross people were looking at there. So, we've been fortunate. We got the money knowing the problem was there, and then we got more grant money afterwards to fix the initial issue that caused the capacity. So it was a win-win as far as that goes. But that's a bit more history.
Okay, thank you for that, Ron. And then I just have a question on the train situation. So one train will get us to that 25-year mark that at high population projection. And then if we really wanted to gamble, go with the 2 trains, and that would obviously give us many more years. So my question is, so we take a conservative approach. We go with 1 train based on today's projection or population projections and on the high end. For the sake of discussion, growth continues at the rate and at a greater rate than we've been experiencing now. And we find out in 10 years that, you know what, we're going to be in need of that second train. Do we have to start that process all over again, this process, all over again? Or is there something that we can do now? And I liken it almost to Lego blocks, to building it so far so that, then you can have so much in place. And then when you need that second train, you just kind of click it on. If you understand what I'm saying. I understand that's very, not very engineer-like, but you understand what I'm saying.
So one of the things we've talked about is doing an EA that encompasses both trains and then stages the construction of them as you hit the target. So that's just, so that would get us out of having to redo an EA 10 years from now. The one thing, I'm just looking at one of the slides. One train will do high growth until at least 2040. That's only 19 years. So that'll be one of the considerations council is going to make when we present numbers. It's not 25 years. It's only 19. So that really has to be thought out, how you handle the second train. Steve can speak to whether you can sort of pre-build some stuff or whatever, but I think we can incorporate it in the EA and talk about staging the parts, and that should get us out of having to do another EA at least.
Okay.
Steve?
Yeah, I think like we'll do everything we can in this EA to describe this, even if the decision is made to do it in stages. We'll explain that it is stages and that the planning is done for 2 more trains, like that'll be done. The ministry is not likely to approve the full capacity of 2 trains. At this point in time, they're limiting us to about 1.25, but that could change over time as well. There could be opportunities to take advantage of the second train, but I don't know. I'm maybe going around in circles here, but we'll do everything we can to avoid having to do work over again if it's so happened in 10 years.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that's all my questions for now. I guess I will ask council one last time if there's any more questions or comments. I don't see any. So maybe I will hand it back over for to kind of go through next steps. I know that this is a public meeting and that there was opportunity for the public to participate, and that it's my understanding that you'll still be accepting public comments on what's been presented for about the next 3 weeks, if that's
that's correct.
Okay.
And next steps for us are to continue the technical evaluations and start firming things up. We're still looking at a spring finalization of this process. We're on track. You know, you go back a bunch of months where we're thinking, what's our schedule? And we're really, even for this meeting tonight, just one month off what we thought it might be, July instead of August. And so we'll work towards that. We'll have some more technical meetings. We will be back to council because council is going to have to make some decisions. And we'll consider comments from the public. Right now, they've got a lot of information. There's not as much to comment on. They might have a lot more to comment on when there's details about how this thing gets paid for and when it's going to happen and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Okay, I appreciate that, Matt. Did I see your hand up, Councillor Regan?
Madam Mayor, just for clarification, for public input, where would they send that?
Well, I think Lisa's email might be on the notice, but if they sent it to Jeff, it would get to us.
All right. Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you. And 3 weeks would put us at September 14th, but I kind of agree with Matt's prediction that likely the next public meeting, when it kind of paints the fuller picture of what it looks like and how much it costs and where that money comes from, we might expect more comment then. But I would encourage anybody that's watching this that if they do have public comment, to make sure that you submit it, and we'll certainly include that. Okay, well, thank you very much for that presentation, Lisa, Steve, Matt. Appreciate it. I know personally, I always appreciate the way it's presented. I can understand it. As I think I've said to you offline before, I think I know more about sewage treatment plants and wastewater plants than I ever thought I would. But it is an important project for our community. It's an exciting project, and it's been interesting, the stages and watching it all roll out. So we look forward to further updates. If there isn't anything else from council at this time, then I would ask for a motion to adjourn our special council meeting at 7:50 p.m. A mover and a seconder, please. Councillor Regan, Councillor Hodgins, all opposed? That's carried. Thank you very much.